What is the deal with the steel? On September 11th, 2001, Donald Trump witnessed the World Trade Center attack. And shortly after that, he spoke to WWOR UPN 9 News.
Donald, you're probably the best known builder, particularly of great buildings in the city. There's a great deal of question about whether or not the damage and the ultimate destruction of the buildings was caused by the airplanes, by architectural defect, or possibly by bombs or aftershocks. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, it was an architectural defect. You know, the World Trade Center was always known as a very, very strong building. Don't forget, that took a big bomb in the basement. Now, the basement is the most vulnerable place because that's your foundation, and it withstood that. And I got to see that area about 3 or 4 days after it took place because one of my structural engineers actually took me for a tour because he did the building. And I said, I can't believe it. The building was standing solid, and half of the columns were blown out. I mean, so this was an unbelievably powerful building. If you know anything about structure, it was one of the first buildings that was built from the outside. The steel, the reason the World Trade Center had such narrow windows is that in between all the windows, you had the steel on the outside. So you had the steel on the outside of the building. That's why when I first looked, and you had big, heavy I-beams, when I first looked at it, I couldn't believe it because there was a hole in the steel. And this is steel that was, you remember the width of the windows in the World Trade Center, folks. I think you know, if you were ever up there, they were quite narrow. And in between was this heavy steel. I said, how could a plane, even a 767 or 747 or whatever it might have been, how could it possibly go through the steel? I happen to think that they had not only a plane, but they had bombs that exploded almost simultaneously, because I just can't imagine anything being able to go through that wall. Most buildings are built with the steel is on the inside around the elevator shaft. This one was built from the outside, which is the strongest structure you can have, and it was almost just like a can of soup.
I want to take a look at how Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross is defending the new steel and aluminum tariff plan. Let's watch.
In the can of Campbell's soup, there's about 2.6 cents, 2.6 pennies worth of steel. So if that goes up by 25%, that's about 0.6 of 1 cent on the price of a can.
You know, Donald, we were looking at pictures all morning long of that plane coming into building number 2. And when you see that approach the far side, and then all of a sudden, within a matter of a millisecond, the explosion pops out the other side.
Right. I just think that it was a plane with more than just fuel. I think, obviously, they were very big planes. They were going very rapidly because I was also watching where the plane seemed to be not only going fast, it seemed to be coming down into the building. So it was getting the speed from going downhill, so to speak. It just seemed to me that to do that kind of destruction is even more than a big plane, because you're talking about taking out steel, the heaviest caliber steel that was used on a building. I mean, these buildings were rock solid, and you know, it's just an amazing thing. This country is different today, and it's going to be different than it ever was for many years to come.
Very profound statement and very true.
Donald, one last question for you. Given the magnitude of how much of American commerce took place within the Twin Towers, what do you, as you're an expert on this, what do you think is going to be the fallout over the next several weeks, months, and even years, given what we have lost in terms of those buildings going down and all that was within it?
Well, I, as an example, Alan, and you might use them too, but I have an insurance company that was on the 102nd floor of the World Trade Center. They're gone. I don't know who's gone. I don't know anything other than their offices are no longer there. They're wiped out. The Morgan Stanley group, you know, Morgan Stanley, a big, powerful firm, they had 50 stories in the building, gone. I mean, you're talking about some firms that are just gone. Now, Morgan Stanley, in that case, had a lot of its offices in Midtown, and they had about half downtown. Morgan Stanley's a big, powerful firm. They're gone. Many firms had all of their offices, as you know, in the World Trade Center. It was 8 million square feet. 8 million square feet is the size of some cities. And we had 8 million square feet in the world, 4 million in each building. They were huge buildings, not only in height, but, you know, each floor was 50,000 feet. They were monstrous floors. each floor was almost a city in itself, and they had 110 floors or so. So, you know, many firms that were easily recognizable for those of us in the financial worlds, for those of us that read the papers and see the financial pages, they're going to be gone. I mean, they're just not going to exist anymore. They're gone.
Donald Trump.
Many of the people are gone with them.
Donald Trump, thank you so very much for joining
Well,
us.
thank you
We
all.
really
Good luck.
appreciate it.
They never thought he would win, but he did.
NATO's greatest strength is the enduring bond between North America and Europe. We saw the strength of that bond after the 9/11 attacks against the United States. And President Trump, those attacks struck at the heart of your own hometown in New York. And for the first time, NATO invoked our collective defense clause, Article 5. One for all and all for one. Hundreds of thousands of European and Canadian soldiers have served shoulder to shoulder with US troops in Afghanistan for over a decade to help ensure it never again becomes a safe haven for international terrorists. It is our solidarity that keeps our nations safe. And when our open and free societies come under attack, we stand up for our values and our way of life. That is why a strong NATO is good for Europe and good for North America. The 9/11 and Article 5 memorial will be a daily reminder of our vital bond. And today we will commit to do more in our common struggle against terrorism. So, Mr. President, it is a great honor to have you here and a great honor to give you the floor. Please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Secretary General Stoltenberg, Chancellor Merkel. Thank you very much. Other heads of state and government, I'm honored to be here with members of an alliance that has promoted safety and peace across the world. Prime Minister May, all of the nations here today grieve with you and stand with you. I would like to ask that we now observe a moment of silence for the victims and families of the savage attack which took place in Manchester. Thank you. Terrible thing. This ceremony is a day for both remembrance and resolve. We remember and mourn those nearly 3,000 innocent people who were brutally murdered by terrorists on September 11th, 2001. Our NATO allies responded swiftly and decisively, invoking for the first time in its history the Article 5 collective defense commitments. The recent attack on Manchester in the United Kingdom demonstrates the depths of the evil we face with terrorism. Innocent little girls and so many others were horribly murdered and badly injured while attending a concert. Beautiful lives with so much great potential, torn from their families forever and ever. It was a barbaric and vicious attack upon our civilization. All people who cherish life must unite in finding, exposing, and removing these killers and extremists. And yes, losers. They are losers. Wherever they exist in our societies, we must drive them out and never, ever let them back in. This call for driving out terrorism is a message I took to a historic gathering of Arab and Muslim leaders across the region, hosted by Saudi Arabia. There I spent much time with King Solomon, a wise man who wants to see things get much better rapidly. The leaders of the Middle East have agreed at this unprecedented meeting to stop funding the radical ideology that leads to this horrible terrorism all over the globe. My travels and meetings have given me renewed hope that nations of many faiths can unite to defeat terrorism, a common threat to all of humanity. Terrorism must be stopped in its tracks, or the horror you saw in Manchester and so many other places will continue forever. You have thousands and thousands of people pouring into our various countries and spreading throughout, and in many cases we have no idea who they are. We must be tough, we must be strong, and we must be vigilant. The NATO of the future must include a great focus on terrorism and immigration, as well as threats from Russia and on NATO's eastern and southern borders. These grave security concerns are the same reason that I have been very, very direct with Secretary Stoltenberg and members of the alliance in saying that NATO members must finally contribute their fair share and meet their financial obligations. But 23 of the 28 member nations are still not paying what they should be paying and what they are supposed to be paying for their defense. This is not fair to the people and taxpayers of the United States. And many of these nations owe massive amounts of money from past years and not paying in those past years. Over the last 8 years, the United States spent more on defense than all other NATO countries combined. If all NATO members had spent just 2% of their GDP on defense last year, we would have had another $119 billion for our collective defense and for the financing of additional NATO reserves. We should recognize that with these chronic underpayments and growing threats, even 2% of GDP is insufficient to close the gaps in modernizing, readiness, and the size of forces. We have to make up for the many years lost. 2% is the bare minimum for confronting today's very real and very vicious threats. If NATO countries made their full and complete contributions, then NATO would be even stronger than it is today, especially from the threat of terrorism. I want to extend my appreciation to the 9/11 Memorial and Museum in New York for contributing this remnant of the North Tower, as well as to Chancellor Merkel and the German people for donating this portion of the Berlin Wall. It is truly fitting that these two artifacts now reside here so close together at the new NATO headquarters. And I never asked once what the new NATO headquarters cost.
Trade wars are good and easy to win, President Trump tweeting early Friday morning. Today, the lawmaker he needs to pass the steel and aluminum tariffs to fight that war, House Speaker Paul Ryan said no. Quote, "We are extremely worried about the consequences of a trade war and are urging the White House to not advance with this plan." The statement from his spokeswoman read. Keeping him honest, you would think if this were so easy, you'd at least have your own party leaders on board. If this were easy, conservative economists would be lining up to support it. They are not. You need industry support, but aside from steel and aluminum makers, it hasn't happened so far. The Beer Institute CEO says aluminum tariffs would cost the beverage industry $347 million and lead to thousands of layoffs. Goldman Sachs estimates a steel tariff could cost Ford and General Motors $1 billion a year. If a trade war were easy, there'd be no threat of retaliation on American products. If it were easy, the head of the European Commission would not be saying this.
Meanwhile, Republicans are figuring out how to get the president to reconsider tariffs on aluminum and steel. Speaker of the House Paul Ryan says that he is extremely worried about a possible trade war, global trade war, that is. However, the president says that he's not backing down. The United States has been getting ripped off.
Our country on trade has been ripped off by virtually every country in the world, whether it's friend or enemy. Everybody. China, Russia, and take people that we think are wonderful, the European Union. We can't do business in there. They don't allow. They have trade barriers that are worse than tariffs.
Trump tweeted out today that he wouldn't apply the tariffs to Canada or Mexico if the countries can come up with a new agreement on NAFTA.